So here's the question that no one ever wants to ask at the end of the Megillah. And frankly, none of us ever want to ask at the end of any fairy tale either. And that is, what happens after the happily ever after? Do Queen Esther and King Ahasuerus get together and have children? And if they do have children together, do they raise them as Jews or Zoroastrians? And if they are not raised as Jews, given all of the fuss we make about Queen Esther standing up and proclaiming to the king that she is Jewish, what are some of the takeaways or lessons we might otherwise learn about Purim? Now, before you say, Rabbi, hold on a second, that is an absolutely preposterous question. Let me first tell you that it wasn't my question. It's one that Chazal, our sages of blessed memory, raised generations ago. And they come up with answers. I also want to tell you, which I'm afraid to say, some of us probably aren't going to like. In one midrashic source, Esther Rabbah, Queen Esther and King Ahasuerus do live happily ever after, and they also do have a child together. And let me be the first to tell you, this child doesn't go on to become the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He is the mighty Zoroastrian king Darius of Persia, who elevates the Jewish prophet Daniel to become the Daniel of the Lion's King fame in his court. And the other source that asks the same question on the subject, Kahala Rabati, doesn't answer much differently. It too argues that Esther and Ahasuerus have a happily ever after, and that they also have a child together. Only this child becomes the famous King Cyrus of Persia, who is admittedly the king who famously permits the Jews to return from their exile in Bavel in Babylonia back to Israel. Both, for the record, are philo-Semitic pro-Jewish kings, but neither of them are Jews. And neither goes on to say that Ahasuerus and Esther had a child who davened in a shtibel in Toko Hills. Instead, what we find is a Jewish woman, a queen who is perhaps dedicated to some degree or dedicated or connected to her Judaism, or perhaps she's even passionate in her own way, but she does not have Jewish children. And so reflecting on these particular teachings this Shabbat, I came up this Shabbat with not what I would call a conventional quote unquote, be proud of your Judaism because Esther was sermon, but three unconventional takeaways about Purim from a story that seems to have an awful lot to say about complex Jewish identities in what I believe in the 21st century. First, and this is a message that for many of us, I want to acknowledge is going to be very, very hard to hear. I want to say that this is a message that has confounded me as a rabbi, and it is one that has confounded Jewish parents, including me for a long time too. And that first message is that the Midrash reminds us that just because you are a connected Jew or proud of your Judaism doesn't mean that your children are necessarily going to see Judaism in the same way, if they even see Judaism at all. I want to share with you that some of the hardest conversations I've had over the years as a rabbi are with dedicated Jewish parents who raised their kids to be proud Jews, but whose children no longer practice or do not consider themselves Jewish. The Midrash this week reminds us that nothing in life we can take for granted as a guarantee. You do your best with your kids, and then they go make their own choices. Would Esther have wanted the proud Jewish Esther for her children to have practiced the religion of the Jewish people? Probably. But because her life was a lot more complicated than that, she was married to Ahasuerus, it wasn't a choice that she necessarily had all the power to make. Which brings me to a second unconventional lesson I think we can learn from these midrashim about Esther and Ahasuerus' children. And here I want to say that I think that there's actually an unwritten rule among Jews that no one ever says publicly, although I think I'm about to do it for the first time today. And that is that the Megillah reminds us that when you are a Jew who becomes famous or important, there seems to be almost a sad, I don't want to say understanding, but a sad acknowledgement that you leave your Judaism behind sometimes as a cost of your fame. It's amazing. Think about it for a moment. Until today, everyone goes bananas about the fact that Sandy Koufax sat out the World Series on Yom Kippur. That happened 60 years ago. How are we still going bananas over it? It's because it rarely, if ever, almost never happens. Sandy Koufax sitting out the World Series was like Esther standing up for her Judaism in the time of Shushan. What do Jerry Stiller, Bernie Sanders, and Adolph Simon Ox, the founder of the New York Times, all have in common? It's that for all of their rise and prominence based on no small part due to their Jewishness, none of them have or had Jewish grandchildren. Ox's father-in-law was the great Reform rabbi in America, Isaac Mayer Wise. And for all of the Bernie memes going around the internet that bring so many smiles to my face, the one place you would never find Bernie Sanders is a synagogue. More likely a church, because one of Bernie's children is actually an Anglican priest. Jerry Stiller is a legend whose wife, Ann Merrill, was a legend converted to Judaism. But his son, Ben Stiller's ex-wife, did not. And yet they've all risen to positions of prominence when it comes to their family lives, so nobody talks about it. Can any one of us put ourselves in Shushan for a moment? Imagine whether there was anyone so audacious in the kingdom of Shushan who would have had the chutzpah to go to Esther in later years and ask her what she, as a Jew, thought of her pagan worshiping child Darius. Of course not. We can almost be rest assured that this never took place. Which is why perhaps, again, while some of us may not like it, a third unconventional lesson that we may take from this midrash and this story of Purim is that there does seem to be some intrigue, if almost not a tacit acceptance, for the children of Jews who do not practice Judaism but go on to become Philo-Semites and help the Jewish people. Again, keep in mind, there are no rabbinic sources to my knowledge that say that Esther gave birth to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Only to two great Persian kings who went on to help the Jewish people. Some of you may even know that within Jewish literature, there is a prominent folk motif about a Jewish boy who goes on to become Pope. All of the stories begin the same way. The boy was kidnapped as a child by non-Jews. He rises through the ranks and becomes the Pope and is about to place a terrible edict against the Jews until somehow his father, who's a prominent rabbi, goes to protest the edict of the Pope. And as the story goes, they both play chess together. And the son remembers some unusual move that only his father could have taught him. And they realize together in that moment that the father and the son are together and the edict is reversed. It's a beautiful folk motif. And as you probably know, there are lots of stories that are similar to this same meme, the same theme. Only over the years that I've studied, I've always been struck by the ending of the story, which I can only think of in one instance, not the majority of instances, and with the Pope somehow converting back to Judaism. In nearly all the cases of this story, the Pope stays the Pope and then supports the Jewish community. Like the Esther story, there seems to be an almost admiration for the non-Jewish children of Jews who go on nonetheless to support and help and aid the Jewish people. Rabbi Lewis reminded me this past week that there is a theory among biblical scholars that the book of Judith, some of you may be familiar with it, if not our own Judith at Eitz Chaim, that story is in the Apocrypha, was written as a corrective to Esther's perceived lack of frumkeit in the Megillah story. In the story of Judith, in some ways, Judith is the anti-Esther. She is kosher, she is Shomer Shabbos, and she marries a Jewish man. And yet, ain't it the darndest thing We have these two stories, only it is the one with the imperfect Esther that gets into the Bible. Judith does not. Perhaps this is because Esther spoke to the challenges of the time in which it was written, just as it speaks to us today. Our Jewish lives in America are increasingly becoming a complex story, just like Purim is a complex and a challenging story. Yet, isn't it remarkable that in the Frum community, even today, there is a tendency of the rabbis to whitewash Esther and to depict her as the perfect Frum housewife going to the mikveh in a long skirt. And if you don't believe me, just look at the Eish HaTorah kids coloring pages. That is certainly how Esther is depicted. Only given Esther's choices in the Megillah, or in fairness, these rabbis writing midrashim about Esther and Achashverosh's children, I have to honestly tell you, I have no idea how that alternative narrative ever really checked out. Like the Esther of old, everywhere we look in our society today are Jews and children of Jews who are either not practicing or not Jewish themselves. And our tendency when this happens, and when we see this, understandably, on one level, is to lament the Judaism that was lost. Only having learned these midrashim and seen them this past week, I want to caution everybody. Before we cry out, let Purim remind us that this is an old story, that we've been there before. The story is as famous of famous Jews is an old story. And despite the choices of Esther, of a queen of Shushan, or even the choices of our children, I think we can take comfort in knowing that we're still here telling the story of Esther's imperfect heroism generations later. Purim reminds us that an edict of destruction, one that if not had been prevented by Esther, could have been like a Holocaust in its day for the people of Shushan. That's the kind of thing that might have destroyed us. But one Jew's choice will not and has never destroyed the Jewish people, our culture, or our way of life. On the contrary, as the Megillah teaches us, it was not only Esther, but her children, Darius or Cyrus, who had a special role in helping the Jewish people to achieve our unique destiny and save the Jewish people. Let us be thankful this Shabbat for their role in that way. Shabbat Shalom.